With increasingly flexible working conditions and a desire to work with the latest technology, it seems that modern-day applicants are demanding more than ever from their prospective employees. Today on LokadTV, we're delighted to be joined by Radu Palamariu, who's going to discuss with us why the recruitment and retention of staff is so important to modern-day companies and what our supply chains can do to attract the top talent. So Radu, thanks very much for joining us today. Perhaps to start off, you could just tell us a little bit more about your background and also your role at Alcott Global, where you're the Managing Director.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be with you today. So Alcott Global is a headhunting firm. We recruit executives in the space of supply chain. So what we mean by supply chain is basically companies that move things on one side or manufacture goods on the other side. So some of our clients are major shipping companies like Maersk or logistics companies like DB Schenker, all the way to major manufacturers of the world, whether it's from healthcare or FMCG, as well as we work with some of the software in supply chain companies, the ones that, similar to you guys at Lokad, optimize and create solutions from a technology perspective. So that's what we do on a regular basis. Now myself, I come from a consulting background. I've done many years in management consulting actually before going into executive search about 8 years ago. And the reason why I went here, because I strongly feel that human side of the business is the make or break of the business. You get the right people, you'll have a great business. You get the wrong people, you will get a faulty business. So that's my passion. People are my passion.
Brilliant. And Joannès, today our topic is hiring in modern supply chains. What is it about the supply chain industry that makes hiring so interesting?
I mean, there are some challenges that are, how do you supply chain companies that have a supply chain advantage are pretty much by design fairly largish companies. I mean, obviously, if you're like tiny company, you don't really have a supply chain per se. So it's a problem that is of interest to companies that are usually sizable. And when it comes to hiring, there is this big challenge is how do you avoid reverting to the mean, which is kind of the curse of getting large, and it's a very difficult problem. And the larger you are, the more challenging it is to not revert to the mean. So that's, I would say, this combination alone makes it very challenging because companies operating supply chain don't have the option of just staying small, just to avoid this regression to the mean pattern. They have to be large for basically leverage economies of scale that have nothing to do with people, just the process, the channels and whatnot. And if you compound that, so you have the fact that you're large by design, you will have super strong forces that put you to the mean, and with, I would say, more modern technologies, especially when it comes to supply chain management, the talent of a few people gets completely compounded.
Okay, Radu, would you agree with that? I mean, kind of companies are pumping so much money into HR departments, the whole recruitment process. I mean, why are they placing so much importance in kind of the people they recruit?
I cannot argue with the fact that people are crucial. So in one of the sessions, I had a recent presentation, and it was all about artificial intelligence, machine learning, algorithms, how we are going to get robotics, robotic process automation, and all of that to replace humans and whatnot. And that it is coming, and it is coming for the mundane tasks, right? But ultimately, it's not technology that makes or breaks a company. It's people. I strongly believe that. So I think it's to Joannès' point. It's about people. Companies are investing in it. We've had, maybe it's overused, war for talent, but it is indeed like that. So if you are in a software business like yourselves, right? There's how many good engineers and coders are there? Well, there's not super many of them, and then you have everybody, literally everybody, fighting for them, right? From the Googles and the Facebooks and the whatnot, right, to different software providers and so on and so forth. So everybody's trying to attract them, And then it's normal for companies to invest fair amount of money in terms of doing this. Putting these strategies and this talent acquisition options in place to make sure that they get the best.
Yeah, okay, so let's look into more about that approach of how we actually find these right people. What can a company do to kind of attract the best talent?
If I take the archetype 20th century mega company operating a mega supply chain, you want to have an army of people that are with very high discipline, very long-term commitment to the company, adherence to company values and everything. And if I take in contrast what I would say more modern players are looking for, if you look for what companies like, let's say, Google or Amazon are looking for, that's absolutely not the sort of I would say, of prime qualities they are looking for. Again, it boils down to the fact that they have technologies and those people will be acting as multipliers, and that the way it kind of works when you start thinking about, especially software technologies, is that it's very counterintuitive in many ways, So what sort of qualities do they look for? And then there is maybe the other question is why. And usually they want to have people that are very creative, that are going to challenge status quo, that are very analytical, that don't necessarily value discipline as much, because the problem is that it's very hard to have people that are very, I would say, very discipline-minded and very creative. It's pick one. You can't have both. If you have like intense respect for hierarchy, it's very difficult also to disrupt the status quo, because your natural inclination is to actually enforce and preserve the status quo. So those tech companies have been precisely looking for people that could, implement the change that they need, and it's a different type of profile and also different type of skills. The amount of nerdiness, I would say, involved, dealing with layers of softwares and vast troves of data. Requires people that have, I would say, certain taste in terms of mostly of, I would say, of numbers, of even programming, coding. Even if it's not your day job, if you are completely ignorant about that, that's typically going to be, something that is going to be a challenge for you if you want to deliver large-scale optimization for any supply chain. So that the things have been shifting, and it's very interesting is that, to my extent, and maybe that will be a question for you.
What I wanted to point out and say that on one side, I agree fully with you, is that it's almost like a fight, if you want, the Cristiano Ronaldos and the Messi of the world, right? In football terms, because football tends to be an analogy that everybody understands. You have these geniuses, these coders, these very creative minds, and pretty much they have offers from 5 different clubs. I mean, the club being a company, or 10. So the question is, how do you make sure that you are the one that ultimately makes the cut? When we think about WhatsApp, right, a few years ago when it was acquired by Facebook, I can't remember exactly the number of employees it had, but it was somewhere between 50 to 70. I can't remember exactly how many it was, but that was a multi-billion-dollar sale, right? And it originated with a small team of people. So to your point, you don't need to have massive amounts of people. You need to have very quality, and it's about the quality, it's about the mindset, it's about the attitude of those people that will ultimately create a good company.
Okay, and Radu, we've spoke a lot here about sort of the recruitment process, but obviously recruitment's only half of the picture. I mean, if you look at millennials now, they're sort of hopping between jobs more frequently than ever. So kind of looking at that kind of retention side of things, what can companies do in order to keep hold of the staff that they recruit?
That I think is a $1 million question, and it is true that millennials have the younger generation has a different way of perceiving things. They're not as motivated as perhaps generation Z or X in terms of money or in terms of status or so on. So then you need to motivate them differently, and they're much faster to get bored, right? I mean, we are, and I myself in some ways, I can, whilst maybe not by age, but by attitude, sometimes I can also get easily bored and distracted. So I think the retention piece boils down to the fundamentals of leadership, right? If you're a good leader, it works whether it's a millennial or a Generation Z or a Generation X. I mean, you know, leaders that listen, that actually give a damn, right? That you talk to the team, you try to understand where are they going, what are they trying to achieve, and try to help them get there. You know, that obviously challenge the team in good ways, set objectives that stretch them, all this good stuff, that whatever you would define as a good leader. But on top of that, for the younger generation, I think it's quite crucial that you give them different tasks that maybe are in general 9 to 12 months you try to give them a new scope, or to change a little bit the scope, because they will easily get bored. So I think that is also key in terms of retaining them, and it's a forever journey, right? So I mean, I think every 6 to 12 months, if not more often, you should have very, very open and candid and heart-to-heart conversation with the staff, just to make sure that, you know, you're still supporting them on what they want to be doing, and then do it. I mean, walk the talk. Don't just you know, pay lip service.
Okay, Joannès, would you kind of agree with that? I mean, in your role as a CEO, what do you see in terms of what your staff should expect from you?
I mean, it's puzzling, because you see, if we look at the world at large, you have like massive counterexample. You know, just look at, for example, Google. Google has been ranked, you know, for many years like #1 most attractive companies. As far as I know, you know, 95% of their revenues are just online ads. So clearly, I mean, it's difficult to be, you know, I would say, to go to a company that is basically optimizing clicks and say you're going to make a difference to the world. It's literally probably as you know, the spectrum goes, maybe you can have people that are doing, you know, companies that are only doing like pure financing instruments that are, I would say, even more meaningless than that. But I think it's, I would say, optimizing only advertising campaigns. I mean, I would say in my rank of values, it's fairly low. So first, yes, there is this popular opinion, which is something that we would like to believe about ourselves. I'll say, yes, people want to have something that makes sense, and if you do a survey, that's what people will answer. And maybe that's what they genuinely believe. But when you look at what people do, they will actually flock to companies that have, like Google, where frankly, in terms of, you know, are you doing like a net good for the world? I would say it's debatable at best, you know. I mean, it's certainly market forces at play. That's fine, but you see, I would be hard pressed to think that, you know, investing thousands of engineers in optimizing click rates is naturally an absolute, you know, net gain for humanity at large. If you look at what those companies have done to actually collect a really impressive share of talents, even if it's not maybe as, you know, politically correct, is that basically they follow something that is much more, I think, mundane in terms of recruiting techniques, which is attract talents. So if you have a leader, people would think, oh, I need a great leader that is going to be charismatic and whatnot. But look at who, for example, Facebook has been putting at the top of their AI department. They took Yann Lequin, which is probably one of the most brilliant AI researcher of the last couple of decades. So basically they took somebody who was like a complete authority, undisputable, who is actually exceedingly talented. And obviously this person alone has been like a magnet for literally thousands of wannabe, you know, AI researchers. And Google has been playing, you know, the same sort of techniques, hiring exceedingly prominent engineers.
Radu, you kind of mentioned it there, that millennials are placing kind of diminishing importance in things like sort of salaries and stuff like that. Fundamentally, you could say that money makes the world go round. So how actually important are salaries and benefits from kind of your perspective?
Look, don't get me wrong. Nobody wants to work for free. It's important, but it's more of a hygiene factor, right? So it's basically, it's a given that, I mean, if you pay on the market, there will be a level of friction. But I would say that it's not the main factor, but you need to be on par with the market, right? So if you pay better, then it's even better. I think there is a term called golden handcuffs. So companies like the ones that you've mentioned, which also tend to pay really well. So then it's also very difficult to leave a Google or a Facebook when you're paid usually 50% or sometimes anyways, the numbers can get quite crazy above the market. But I would say for the rest of the companies, then it pretty much, you need to make sure that your pay structure is on par with what your competition is paying. Of course, if you're in a startup world, you might want to consider throwing in share options or different other perks that would make people committed to the company for longer. It's not even only in the startup world. I mean, it's most of the tech companies have some sort of scheme that would do that. So let's not totally take off salary, but what I'm saying is it's not usually, or at least from my perspective, is not usually the main reason why people choose company X versus company Y.
Dive in there, Joannès.
An interesting thing about the perks that you mentioned, going to another thing, is that also when it comes to hiring talents, people see perks, especially because you have like visible perks, like at Google, where you have like a baby food, or a tennis table, lying somewhere, and that's, I would say, a visible perks. That's visible perks, and that's, you can show that on TV news, it looks good, etc., etc. But again, my experience and my understanding is that it's not so much those perks that really help for talents. It's things that are much more subtle, because it's not what those companies are doing, is that what they are not doing. So you should look at what is actually missing instead of look at what is visible. And it's very interesting because, for example, at Lokad, we are lucky enough to be able to hire people that were, let's say, traditionally in the finance sector, that would be considered as top talents. And for example, there are certain things that, let's say, banks, for example, are doing, which are really a recipe to get rid of your talents. Nothing like having people working under constant arbitrary deadlines. That's, let's have like constant made-up deadlines that reflect nothing except the management that just want to pressure you more. Although you're already talented, you're already fairly committed to your job. So the idea that by giving you a semi-impossible deadline, you would actually do better, it's like slightly dumb. And it's very funny because one of the sort of things that where you see that those very, very good companies, let's say the Facebook of this world, they have practices where they are very careful at avoiding, this sort of toxic element in the culture that are adverse to the acquisition and then the retention of talent.
And Radu, one of the other sort of benefits we're seeing a lot is this idea of working remotely now. Obviously, location is an important factor, but how important is that from your perspective?
Now we are faced, because of the coronavirus, we're probably faced with the largest, we are faced with the largest forced experiment of work from home, because it's a very much of a pandemic situation, and a lot of the companies in the affected areas have already asked their staff to work from home. But in normal situations, in an industry like shipping or logistics or manufacturing, now, in all honesty, a lot of things cannot be done from home. Now, if you talk about software on the other side, where you're talking about software and supply chain software and platforms and all of that obviously it matters if you have that flexibility. I think people appreciate it. I think there's been clear studies, and Microsoft did one in Japan recently where it was very clearly documented that that was a shortening of the work week to 4 days, and people somehow still were more productive than working 5 days. So I do thoroughly believe that it's good. I mean, it's again, a fundamental. It's good to give people flexibility, and it's good to trust people, and it's good to trust that they would do the right thing. So I think if you give that, it's a plus for a lot of companies. We have in this world now, you have startups that literally exist remotely, and you know, people that work in different parts of the world, they come together every so often, but most of the work is done remotely.
Okay, we're going to have to start sort of concluding here, but Joannès, from what you've seen in the supply chain industry as a whole, are there all the sort of skills out there, or can you see sort of a skills shortage coming up over the next coming years?
So I would say that there are two types of skills that I believe that where supply chain companies should be more attentive. One is very simply writing skills. I mean, supply chains are invariably complex, you know, and invariably made up of tons of arbitrary decisions that seems arbitrary, but there might be some motivation. And at Lokad, when we see, you know, with most of our clients, it's completely oral traditions, which is a blocking factor when you want to really optimize anything, when basically it's pure oral tradition. It's very hard, and that things are not written down, motivation are not written down, etc. So I think a first step is to go to, I would say, writing mode, which, by the way, when people start to work remotely, writing skills becomes a lot more important. And by the way, if you look at companies that have put an enormous emphasis on writing skills, historically, it's Amazon. Amazon is very famous for its memos. And by the way, if you go before that, Procter & Gamble was 30 years ago, 40 years ago, very famous also for putting a lot of emphasis on writing skills. So that's where I see that those skills are undervalued, I would say, typically in the supply chain world. And I believe that it's putting a lot of limitations in, I would say, deploying innovation, deploying improvement, making things better, and especially coordinating large amount of people, you know, many countries, many cultures, etc., etc. Obviously, when I say writing skills, I mean English writing skills. That's just the way it is. And then the second one is, I would say, mechanical sympathy for numbers and data. And again, if you supply chain, you have like large distributed systems, you know, made up of machines, people, software. So it's very hard to see a supply chain in action, you know, especially when all your problems are basically bottlenecks that can pop up anywhere. I mean, it's not actually something that you can see, that you can touch. Problems get displaced instead of being solved. So you need, one way or another, you know, numbers to kind of sort it out. And again, having people that are very analytical, that are, you know, at ease with large quantities of numbers is really a plus. So I think that the two broad skills that are underappreciated, it's writing skills on one hand, and I would say quantitative mindset on the other hand. But I have biases, obviously, okay, as far as those skills are concerned.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up there, but thanks both for your time today. So that's everything for this week. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again in the next episode. Bye for now.